This panel deals with what one could say is the flip side. So in the morning, we heard all about regulatory approaches. Now we're going to hear about law enforcement approaches using the antitrust laws on a case-by-case basis. Now, some might say this is an approach that's quite a bit different from the regulatory approaches, and others would say actually it's a complement. And we're all trying to figure out exactly when we should be using a regulatory approach and when we should be using an antitrust approach, which looks at things, of course, on a case-by-case basis. And so when the antitrust laws look at what was called this morning an integrated delivery system, and I'd like to use that term a little bit because then we don't have to get into, well, what exactly is an ACO, which, of course, Massachusetts is going to tell us pretty soon with their regs what an ACO may be. So when we look at integrated delivery systems on a case-by-case basis under the antitrust laws, we're looking at the sheer size of it, and is that size a problem? And if the size is a problem, are there any efficiencies that might outweigh that? We're looking at growth. So when we think of growth, we think of mergers, for example, or acquisitions, and that's been in the news quite a bit lately, and we have a quite experienced enforcer to talk about that. We think about integrations in an integrated delivery system that may fall short of a merger or acquisition. And that was the discussion we had this morning about contracts and using contractual vehicles. And finally, we're also looking at conduct. So we could have an integrated delivery system that we all feel on balance is fine and appropriate, but they may be engaging in conduct to kind of gild the lily, as it were, to try to realize an increased cash flow for their members at the expense of the public. So in terms of looking at these different issues and the different types of conduct, such as exclusionary conduct or tying, which for those of you who've seen the St. Luke's opinion, the court was clear that in looking at conduct, you cannot use laws that deal with acquisitions to deal with the potential for future anti-competitive conduct. You need to rely on the antitrust laws that actually deal with conduct to address those kinds of issues. So in discussing what may seem to be quite a complicated set of laws, we have an excellent panel for you here today. We have Tom Dahdouh, who is the executive director of the FTC out here in the West, and who was an instrumental part of the FTC's victory in the St. Luke's case in dealing with the hospital system's acquisition of a physician group in Nampa, Idaho, which is a fairly small, I guess you would call it an exurb or a bedroom community, about 30 miles away from the capital city in Idaho. Then we have Josh Soven, who not only has himself a very deep enforcement background, but can really represent the perspective of the private bar here in dealing with hospitals, physician groups, and other folks who might comprise an integrated delivery system and give their perspectives on what's going on with the antitrust laws and maybe where we want to draw some lines, both in enforcement of those laws and in the balance between antitrust laws and a more regulatory approach. Then we have Anne-Marie Marciarille, who, of course, comes from a state enforcement background that's very deep and now has moved on to develop an extensive policy background as well. And then she's going to be followed by Jaime King, who can give us a very in-depth, who's last but not least, and can give us a very in-depth policy look at all of these issues, including, and not least, if you find a violation, what do you do by way of a remedy? Is it structural? Do you break up an integrated delivery system? Is it conduct-based? Do you try to use a quasi-regulatory approach in saying what the integrated delivery system can do and can't do, and what happens if you meet bumps in the road? Then following that, we have two commentators, myself, to give a little bit more of the state perspective, and Maribeth Shannon, who also has a very deep policy background and will undoubtedly be a great jumping off point for what I hope will be an exciting round of questions and answers. So with that, let me ask Tom Dahdouh to please start us off. Tom?
Hi. Thanks for the introduction and the promotion. I'm actually the regional director for the FTC's Western Region offices. We have an office here in San Francisco that does do antitrust work. And while I was not personally involved in the St. Luke's case, there were folks on the staff there, most importantly Tom Green, formerly of the California Attorney General's office, who led that case, so anyway, appreciate it, Emilio. So first thing, just want to point out, every word out of my mouth is from me. I do not represent the views of the commission, any commissioner, any staff, anyone else. These are just my words. Okay? So we're still going. There you go, and there it is. But just moving on to the major message, and so it's we're all talking about ACOs, and my part of this is to just talk about the antitrust enforcement with respect to horizontal mergers and horizontal combinations, and the message is that ACOs are most likely to benefit consumers where their formation does not reduce that competition, that horizontal competition, that it is important in acute care hospital services, physician services, any ancillary services. And just talk a little about the FTC's antitrust experience in this area, because that experience has been a tough and rocky road. There were the years in the desert, the 1990s. A series of losses for a variety of reasons, one of which state action immunity, and I'm not sure that case is actually in here, but we had, and before the Supreme Court and Phoebe Putney finally went over it, we had courts saying, well, in the grant there, the hospital has the ability to contract and buy pens and IV, products and all kinds of things. They have the right to merge to monopoly in their local area, and that's okay. And the court said, yes, state has expressly decided to displace competition. It's only recently the Supreme Court has said, well, wait a minute, no. So it's interesting, in the last panel I heard people terrified of the issue of state action immunity, but really that has been an area where the agency has only recently had a change in the law, but recently we've had a series of wins. Phoebe Putney's there, St. Luke's, ProMedica are there, and how did this happen? How did we go from a series of losses to a series of wins? What changed? Why did the federal courts change their views? So I think there's several things that were going on. One was, over time, a rejection of economic theories that had kind of led to very overbroad geographic markets. Second, a rejection of this notion, you're a nonprofit, you're really there for the good of the people, you're not there to exercise market power. Third was, a more skeptical view on asserted efficiency benefits. The hospital executives trot out and say, we're here to help people, and the judge doesn't automatically say, good, you can merge to monopoly, that's okay. But underlying all these changes, I think, in this history is really something that has undergirded, which is the empirical evidence that mergers that have been green-lighted by courts may have led to price increases. And this is, a retrospective the FTC conducted. It was initiated by a Republican chairman, Tim Uris, to really go back and let's look and see what happened. And I think that empirical evidence, and particularly the Sutter Summit transaction here, I think that empirical evidence has really changed the dynamic there. So before I get into the specifics, though, on that long trajectory, there's just one thing I do want to say, which is in this whole endeavor of the FTC, the push in this area for in antitrust enforcement in healthcare has been a bipartisan one. The agency has had Republican chairmen, they've had Democratic chairmen at the FTC, but this enforcement approach has been a unified one. There have not been, these cases that have been voted out by the agency have not been 3-2s and wild changes. It has been a 25-year consensus by antitrust enforcers, Democrat, Republican, that antitrust enforcement is important in healthcare, and that undue combinations and of market power are likely to lead to higher costs, higher prices, and reduced quality. It just is what it is. And you can run around because there are lots of independent agencies at the in the federal government where you have wild swings in policy from administration to administration. This has really been a bipartisan consensus. Similarly on state action immunity too. The push of the agency to really push back at the courts in the 90s who said, oh, hospital has the right to contract for pens, it has the right to merge to monopoly. Wait a minute, we need to think about that. So just something to think about. But anyway, moving to the analysis, the actual analysis, particularly geographic market analysis. Back in the 90s, everything was based on the Elzinga-Hogarty test. It was little in from outside, little out from inside, LIFO and LOFI. Focus was patient flow. And here, I think, the market, and I can't remember the exact metes and bounds of the Sutter Summit, of the market the judge found in Sutter Summit. Let's just say it went on quite a distance into the Central Valley. And in the study, the judge found that the distant competitors were not constraining prices, and the nonprofit status didn't change the fact that the entity had market power and was raising prices. So part of that was a focus on, well, exactly how do we look at how prices are set in healthcare? And is it really based on patient flow, on where patients go? And the change really was an understanding that it's really the insurers, the buyers, and not individual patients who are the price-setting bargaining entity. And this is this notion of a first-stage competition versus second stage. In the first stage, it's the insurers and the providers who are bargaining over price to determine which providers will be in the network. That is the price-setting issue. And so that insight has shifted our analysis in geographic market and in competitive effects analysis from patient flows to the negotiating strength of a firm before or after a merger or a combination. And that's really, I think, the key insight there. And it informs a lot of how we've looked at these mergers. The second key thing is this nonprofit defense. There was a paper in the 90s that claimed that, that nonprofits, were not exercising market power. That's been debunked. And as Judge Posner, I have my quote from Judge Posner, adoption of the nonprofit form does not change human nature. So on that. So moving on to the actual cases. First case, ProMedica. Hospital merger in Ohio. Geographic market was Lucas County, Ohio. 4 hospital providers in Lucas County. ProMedica was the dominant hospital with 47% of the market, followed by Mercy at 29, University at 13, St. Luke's at 11.5. The FTC argued that the acquisition by ProMedica of St. Luke's would give it a large percentage of the market. St. Luke's, Idaho, area in Nampa, which is outside of Boise, and this was St. Luke's, a hospital that already owned a physician group in Nampa, sought to purchase Salzer, the largest remaining independent physician group in Nampa. Focus here is the overlap in primary care physician services as opposed to ProMedica, which was an overlap in acute care hospital services. So in St. Luke's, there was no dispute on the product market, but the issue that was vigorously contested was geographic market. The defense argued the market was much broader than Nampa and that went 30 miles to the western edge of Boise. FTC argued that Nampa was the appropriate market. This is a slide from Dr. Dranov's testimony in that case. And what Dr. Dranov testified to, what the FTC argued, and what the court found is that, again, it's the health insurance companies that are the key here in determining where buyers can turn to for alternative sources of supply, which is the geographic market test. And that the evidence was payers testified they couldn't sell product without local Nampa primary care physicians. And there were even documents saying that they need Salzer at primary care physicians in order to market itself to employers. And then, by contrast, testimony saying there was no competition between Nampa and West Boise, as the defense was contending. Again, and then moving on to the competitive effects analysis, similarly, the buyers, the health insurance companies, in our view, drove that analysis too. And this is really about bargaining leverage. Before the deal, Salzer primary care physicians were a substitute for St. Luke's primary care physicians, and vice versa. So the health plans had a credible outside option when negotiations with either entity faltered, or they weren't getting the price they wanted. After this deal, the health plans, and they testified, they lost this credible key outside option, and the provider gained significant negotiating leverage. As a result of that merger, nearly 80% of primary care physician services in Nampa would be controlled by St. Luke's. And the HHIs, our way of kind of figuring out the actual concentration in the market, went up dramatically. ProMedica, switching to ProMedica, the same issue came up in the competitive effects analysis, which is the court, the FTC argued and the court accepted that the key focus of the antitrust analysis is how does the deal change the bargaining leverage of insurers? And the court found that the higher prices were explained by greater bargaining leverage vis-a-vis the insurers. The insurers testified that the network without the merging parties would not be commercially viable. They had no alternative threat. And there was evidence that ProMedica had offered insurers a discount if they'd exclude St. Luke's from the network. So you see right there something that could be lost. And then we had some good documents from St. Luke's that the merger has the greatest potential for higher hospital rates and bring a lot of negotiating clout. It's always helpful when they lay it all out in their emails. So based on the evidence, the court found that higher market shares led to higher prices. And the deal would have given them, ProMedica, a 50% share of the market in primary hospital services and an 80% in OB services. ProMedica also argued a flailing firm defense, claiming they had financial difficulties, and this is something that the agencies have encountered in the past. In this case, the court rejected that argument. While they had some difficulties, they'd increased their market share prior to the merger, and that they had sufficient cash reserves to pay all their obligations and meet their capital needs without any additional borrowing. ProMedica's cert petition has been denied by the Supreme Court, and our understanding from the media sources are they're actually starting to think about divesting St. Luke's. So that's where that case is. In St. Luke's argued that there were great efficiencies from the deal. And it's important to note the agency, the FTC, takes efficiency defenses very seriously. We look very closely to see whether those efficiency claims are merger specific, whether they're cognizable, and whether they outweigh the anti-competitive effects from a merger. And but in this case, our conclusion, which was upheld by the court and the Ninth Circuit, was that their efficiencies really were not merger specific, or they were not cognizable. Again, key things, and these are takeaways. You know, employing physicians is one, because that deal was all about employing physicians, a hospital employing physicians, is one way to put together a unified, committed team of physicians, but it's not the only way. And the same efficiencies have been demonstrated with other groups of physicians. Similarly, with respect to claimed efficiencies from the EPIC, from IT combinations, found that those were not merger specific. The entities on their own could have been making these changes and improvements. The Ninth Circuit, in their decision, added a further fillip, that not only do the efficiencies have to be merger specific, cognizable, but also be competition enhancing. I think what you see in the court is a lot of skepticism about efficiencies, and I would query whether one of the reasons for that is the lack of empirical evidence that you know, efficiencies have been achieved from horizontal merger combinations in healthcare systems. And so what you're seeing from the courts is kind of the flip side of what happened to the FTC in the 90s, where they were kind of skeptical about us. I'm not sure that, you know, that these mergers are going to lead to higher prices, to a flip side where they're a little skeptical, and you know, this is probably an area where, you know, they're looking for some evidence and they're not seeing it. I think it's something that definitely was a theme in St. Luke's, so it's something to think about. And then similarly, you know, that the literature is not really supporting this notion that hospitals buying doctor groups it necessarily is going to lower costs or improve quality. And just one thought, my thought, that it might be because, and we heard this a little on the first panel, that a lot of the cost savings that can happen from integrated delivery systems can happen by reducing hospital utilization, and a hospital-led, financially integrated combination may not be the best position to do that. And then there's this recent study, New England Journal of Medicine, similarly going to the bottom, finding that, again, financial integration, you know, may not be necessary in order for ACOs to achieve lower spending in Medicare. That came out. I'm sure you guys are talking about this during the day, but that's another thing. So alternatives. You know, what alternatives are out there? And for that, I would just say a good starting point is to look at the Norman PHO advisory opinion, where the agency said that a clinical integration was okay there. This was a hospital with a market share over 50% of discharges, but interestingly, the physician hospital organization was not going to increase that percentage. The physician market had over 50% of all physicians. The key to approval there, non-exclusivity. There was neither de jure or de facto exclusivity. So that's one thing to look at. So in conclusion, I think this history, it's illustrative in many ways of importance of antitrust, and demonstrates the importance of competition. So with that, I'll give it to you.
One of the benefits of not using a PowerPoint is you can change your presentation substantially based on, I'm just going to close this, based on what you've heard thus far, which has been very interesting. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come here today. I frequently, picking up on the disclaimer said at the beginning of the initial presentation, I frequently gave that disclaimer when I was in the government, and I often thought it was a little bit counterintuitive, because while I said I was really giving my own views, as a practical matter, I was often quite restrained in saying what I thought. In this case, in this case, I no longer have those constraints, and so I'm happy to opine perhaps a little more expansively than I used to, although my superiors told me push things to the limit at times in my prior jobs. So a couple points to start, and then I will kind of segment my remarks both in picking up on what we just heard and then also circling back to the first panel. The opening point, since this is a conference about ACOs, is I'm a big fan of ACOs. And I think people should be, regardless of their politics and regardless of where they are on the political or enforcement or regulatory spectrum. Because in many ways, I think they are a terrific device for markets to work. They facilitate more intelligent decisions on the demand side. They allow consumers to purchase a package of goods and services in a much more easy, accessible way in which they can evaluate the price much better, evaluate the quality much better, and evaluate overall what they're getting much better. The second overall point is that it is clear from the first panel that there is enormous skepticism, at least in certain jurisdictions, and I suspect in many, that antitrust enforcement alone is going to get there. If antitrust enforcement could do it, none of that would be necessary, or a lot of that would not be necessary. The third point, which is related to the second, is those presentations reflected in many ways what I thought was a profound skepticism of the ability of markets to get things done and to improve the situation. And while I certainly grant you and stipulate that there are significant market conditions and what economists would call market failures that do not exist, that exist in the healthcare markets that don't exist, say, across the bay in the technology markets, I do think there's a danger that you can take that skepticism too far and overlook market solutions. So let me begin a little bit with kind of picking up with where Tom left off and giving you my perspective on what the FTC, the Justice Department, and the states are doing on the enforcement regime, and then I'll segue over to the regulation. With regard to enforcement, I think it is incorrect, by and large, to say that the courts have changed their views. No doubt things evolve, and that's the case. But where I really think the credit goes to turning around that string of massive losses to that string of massive wins that's put a little bit of terror into the provider community is, candidly, the FTC and the state AGs did a much better job trying the cases. They did what a company would do, is they went back and looked at what had gone wrong, and they had a fair amount of data to see what had gone wrong, analyzed that carefully. Chairman Muris, followed by Chairman Majoris, followed by Chairman Kovacic, followed by Chairman Leibowitz, followed by Chairman Ramirez, all really looked at that information carefully and dramatically changed how they tried the cases. So if you went back and looked at the trial records from the cases in the 90s to the cases post-Evanston, I suspect you would see a dramatically different approach that reflects the outcome. The point there is not to look for heroes or villains in the courts or in the industry, but let's look at what we're doing and see if we can do a better job. And shockingly, if we do a better job, we often get better results. And the search for heroes and villains in this industry in general, I think, is not productive. Everybody agrees these are very substantial issues. They're very hard. There's a lot of money at stake. There's enormous ethical issues. If people knew how to solve them with perfection, they would have done it a long time ago. In short, there's always room to do it better. With regard to what enforcement is doing and what it is not doing and what it may do in the future and what it's unlikely to do in the future, a few observations. All of those cases, or for the most part, those cases that were up on the slide presentation in the last, just a minute ago, had a set of common characteristics reflecting very careful strategic decision-making by the agencies about which cases they bring and which they don't. Those cases tend to be markets where there are high degrees of concentration, 2 to 3s, maybe a 4 to 3, 3 to 2s, maybe a 4 to 3, not a 5 to 6, not a 7 to 6, not a 6 to 5. They tend to be in places that are relatively small, i.e. it is much easier to define the relevant geographic market, which you must do in merger cases. And there were cases where the evidence was very strong, I presume, that the efficiencies justifications were pretty weak, and that there was a bunch of documents saying prices were going to go up. My point is not to minimize those successes. Those successes are, were quite substantial achievements, but they do reflect a fairly narrow slice of the market. And while we may see cases that are brought in more densely populated areas with more competitors, I think the prospects for a large number of those cases is relatively small, which brings us back to all that regulation we heard about in the first panel. So I think the Commission will continue to do those cases. I think they'll continue to do them well. Providers need to understand that if you've got a 3-2, your justifications need to be pretty good. Otherwise, you're likely to lose. The Commission has learned how to win those cases, and that will happen. But for those looking for dramatic expansions in the level of enforcement, the number of cases brought, maybe we'll see a few more that push the margins a bit, but I'm not sure you're going to see that many more, with one caveat that I'll get to in just a minute. I have two main sort of quarrels, if you will, from the provider perspective with what the Commission is doing. The first is, and this was mentioned a little bit, I think the standard for failing, flailing, financially distressed firm is too high and is regressive in many ways. I forget the exact language, but the language was, well, look, there's enough cash to pay your bills. You're not going to go under. You've got some capital. The creditors aren't about to foreclose. Well, personally, that is not my standard for deciding what hospital I'm going to go to. I think that's, and that's, I think, not the standard of most of the people in this room. And that when these mergers take place, where people are sort of analyzing these financial status issues, they tend to be in places that are relatively low income, where people do not have a lot of choice, and where all of us, say, okay, that's fine for them, but maybe not fine for us. And I think that people do need to give a little bit more of a multivariable analysis in analyzing financial distress when deciding whether a 3-2 is violating the antitrust laws or not. Now, all of that is not to push all the burden on the agencies. I think the parties in these cases, in their advocacy before the FTC, before the Justice Department, and before the state AGs, need to do a better job explaining why financial distress really matters, even if you're not going under. As a practical matter, given that it's a hospital, it's really hard to kill. They're hard to go under. They're never going to hit that Rasputin-like death standard in order to qualify for the defense. But that doesn't mean it doesn't really matter. And I think the industry can devote resource to showing, well, look, if my return on investment is X and I have a little bit more capital, that really will produce a better quality of service on balance, and that will help people making $35,000 a year. So I see room for a more sophisticated, more multidimensional analysis on the financial viability issues, and I think both the agencies and the industry can do a better job in doing that. With regard to efficiencies, it's, that's a little bit all over the place. The agencies, I do think, take it seriously. I think they probably should take it a little bit more seriously. But I take the point, it is on the providers to do a better job demonstrating that. I think that will happen. I do think they will do a better job. And when they do a better job, I think they're going to win 3-2 merger challenges. That while courts, are fine blocking structural deals with highly concentrated markets where there's no evidence of efficiencies, price is not the end-all be-all. And I do think where people can show, look, quality will go up a little bit, I think they're going to win those cases in industry, unlike in other industries where they may not. So that's sort of where I am on enforcement. The one qualifier, the one potential change out there, and I'm glad there's a representative from Massachusetts here, is whether people start to look at what I think was called bundling and the like. And that's code for, can the combination of non-competing assets raise price? That is a sensitive, controversial issue. The Commission has not brought those cases. I think the Commission is wise not to bring those cases. The Justice Department clearly decided not to bring it in the partners case, though you probably have more information on that than I would. But I do think the industry does need to be aware that that issue is out there and that state AGs may not be so sanguine about relying on the one monopoly rent theory as a reason not to bring an enforcement action. More to come on that, but it's clearly an issue people are considering. So let me move a bit to what we heard about in the first panel. That, again, reflects that, look, there's no silos. If what everybody was doing in Washington or in the state AGs was perfect, none of that would need to exist. Couple of observations on that. The first, in all of that discussion, and it was detailed and extensive and it kind of made sense, and I thought what was interesting is I wondered where the federal ACO sort of regulation had gone. Because to step back, when these ACOs were first rolled out as the savior of the whole thing in the context of the Affordable Care Act, the federal antitrust agencies did contemplate doing something like that, an extensive screening system. It was put out for public comment. The critiques were very, very substantial. It was shot down, and that was the end of that. And I think the federal agencies have largely been out of the game. But it's clearly moved to the states, where there's a lot of opportunities for experiment, and there's opportunities for successes, and there's opportunities for failures. So a big observation of what I heard was nothing about demand. All of that was supply. Here are all of the things we are going to make you do and make you report, and the information you need to provide to get sort of out from under what's really going on in these things. And that's fine, and there's some benefits to that. And clearly a big market failure to potentially correct is better sharing of information on quality, successes, and failures so that people in the industry can learn what's going on in California and how that can work in New York and vice versa. But I do not think people should give up on demand so easily. The fundamental, I think, differentiator between what goes on in the healthcare markets and what goes on in every other market is not substantially greater levels of concentration. Yeah, there's some markets that are concentrated in small places. That's true. But if you look around, there's actually a lot of supply out there. A 30% market share, which is your cutoff in Texas, that doesn't usually lead to an enforcement action in most industries. The challenge is not the number of providers and suppliers and hospitals in most places. There's a lot of them. The challenge is that demand does not discipline performance the way it does in other markets, because consumers and employers have a hard time figuring out quality, they have a hard time figuring out how to price, they have a hard time balancing the two against the other. And I think government, industry, and academics can really make a big contribution in figuring out ways to push more information to the market so consumers can choose that lower-priced ACO as opposed to that higher-priced ACO, even if the brand isn't quite as shiny and well-distinguished. So I really would urge people to think about that, because all those regulations out there, you're going to get it wrong some of the time. It's never going to work, or it won't work all the time with perfection. The reason most markets in America work is consumers punish those who fail, and they reward those who succeed. That does not happen enough in the healthcare markets. So more of that, I think, would be useful. As it was indirectly in there, or directly or indirectly, there was a bunch of information about that seemed to restrict supply and entry. It still baffles me, and I've done this at both agencies and in private practice, that the healthcare markets are one of the few markets where people, if not the only market, where people take seriously the argument that if you move the supply curve towards the y-axis, that somehow is going to lower price. I just, to this day, I do not understand that. I was always taught that pushing output out lowers price, increases efficiency, gives consumers more choice. Now, it's not to say the argument is completely frivolous. I understand the basis for it. But I think there should be a lot of skepticism about blocking entry. Like, there was a line up there on one of the slides about disruptive innovation, sort of at the bottom of one of those slides. That's good. That's not bad. That's okay. Small, light, fast alternative mechanisms for delivery, lower price, improve quality, give consumers more choices and more transparency. And I would be extremely cautious about doing anything which prevents that. To go back to the leverage point again, about setting up regulations that prevent acquirers or prevent providers from acquiring non-competing assets, I would do that with a lot of caution. That is a complicated analysis. It is a slippery slope. It can lead to some very disruptive allocative decisions. It benefits certain consumers. It harms others. There's reason that's a serious discussion, but I think people should not leap to the conclusion that because putting a physician group into a hospital network may result in some nominal price increase for that physician group, that is automatically bad. That picks winners and losers in a way in which consumers can be the losers. Payers, a brief comment on that. There's been a tendency for years, to think of payers as one camp wearing one jersey, providers as one camp wearing the other jersey, and those things really don't have much to do with each other. And they're at war, and policymakers will sort it out and kind of divide up the rents or the profits or whatever you want to call them. That, I think, is a false choice and mistake. Just as restrictions on supply in the provider community are dangerous, restrictions on supply in the payer community are dangerous. More competition in the payer community produces more competition in the provider community, and vice versa. Those things are highly related. I don't want to take too much time, but the Justice Department's closing statement about the Pittsburgh situation, about UPMC and West Penn and Highmark, all of that shows how when things become too concentrated at both levels, what you can get is lock-in effects in which entry is deterred and new and innovative mechanisms sort of are squashed. With that, let me stop, and I look forward to your questions.
So my name is Anne Marie Marciarille, and I'm a professor of health law, healthcare regulation, antitrust, and civil procedure at the University of Missouri in Kansas City. I'll tell you the smartest thing anybody told me when I moved to Missouri, no, that's not a Missouri accent you're hearing, was that, there's a kind of a bipolar thing in this state about the Missouri thing. And here's my trick as an out-of-stater, not a, show-me state native. Just every sentence, use both. So I'm Anne Marie Marciarille, and I teach at the University of Missouri in Kansas City, and greetings from the great state of Missouri. You are relieved to know that I am not going to talk about healthcare regulation in the state of Missouri because I would be done. Okay? So when I say I'm a professor of healthcare regulation in part in the great state of Missouri, you know I'm talking federal. Now, it's a good thing that I'm interested in privately ordered space because there's a lot of opportunity to delve into this in the state of Missouri when it comes to healthcare regulation. Instead, when I thought I was assigned to this panel, I looked for guidance from Emilio, and he said, well, say some things about things that interest you. So here we go, okay? The first thing I want to talk about is, so what about the ACO guidelines? And people use that, I think, as a sort of a shorthand, but because actually we have a kind of a incredible basket, right, of guidance things. We have the ACO policy statement, the 1996 statements of antitrust enforcement policy in healthcare, the 2004 healthcare report, the collaboration guidelines. Then there's been speeches, presentations, discussions. I don't know about you, it's tough keeping up. Okay, there is a lot of airtime being spent talking about antitrust and ACOs. This is good. I actually applaud the agencies, but it's also trying to put it all together as if it's one coherent thing. I'm not so sure, all right? So I'm always sort of like, always start with a practical point, right? So how about this? Have they helped or hurt? Well, the FTC DOJ working group, their last report, only a handful of requests have come in for expedited review. Now, what we can take from the sounds of silence is tricky, right? They're all hiding in the weeds, right? Don't ask, don't tell. Or, in fact, it's all such, a model of clarity, and brilliant explication of antitrust law as applied to these entities that we're good. I think it's too soon to tell. But I think it's interesting that we've kind of set up, I was joking with Kim, I don't want to make fun of any of the states, but I'll make fun of everybody. I'm an all-purpose make funner. We've set up an elaborate mousetrap, right? But you know what? We haven't really gotten it in operation yet in some ways, so we can't tell. Is it a mousetrap or a Rube Goldberg machine? Right? We don't know yet. Right? We need to have some little mice come along before we, I think, can have an intelligent opinion. But I thought that was interesting. I also think this kind of preliminary data, I too have been reading the Michael McWilliams report paper out of Harvard Medical School with great interest. He tries, and I think he tries not to overclaim, but I think he makes some interesting observations. You know, look at the Pioneer ACO program from, what, 32 to 19. We had a small universe. We have an even smaller universe from which to try and draw any conclusions, right, about how these things actually work. And so it's a small universe to study, although the results did show it met the criterion for program expansion, budget neutrality, right, and quality of care was not diminished. And I think even more so if you look at the, what was it, the proposed rule for the Medicare Savings Program. Okay, the comments closed on February 6th. There we can see the hand, I think, from now we're 10,000 feet up, of sort of reverse engineering some of the aspects of the Pioneer program back into the Medicare Shared Savings Program. In some ways beginning to look more alike. Or at least arguably, we could say this beginning to seem more alike. But, you know, I like his tentative conclusions that ACOs that save money were more likely to have two outstanding characteristics. Just play with this even if you don't think, you know, the data supports it. To offer docs individual financial incentives, one, and two, to create preferred networks for referrals. The second, no big surprise, right? Both predictable and predictably concerning. The former, I think, under-discussed, okay, in health law and healthcare regulation. We need to harness the entrepreneurial spirit of providers. Okay, and if you ask me, you know, we were making up definitions of, you know, integrated, I would be like, I'd want to put that in there somewhere, okay? Because I actually think the success, I think you might be onto something here, okay? May rise and fall on that. At any rate, time will tell. It's still so early. But I thought those were interesting things to point about. The second thing that I wanted to talk about, remember I was trying to be useful, right? So I wanted to also throw in, you know, we're having a competition here to define ACOs. So also the new proposed rule, who noticed this? Remember we talked about, well, it could be whether you have this status with the state or that or this format. Did anybody notice? Now you have to have what? A separate tax identification number, right? If that goes through as proposed. That's interesting, okay? I think it demonstrates, I don't want to read too much into this, but an emphasis on purposelessness, if I'm saying that right, that you have to have a purpose to create one. So this whole, it's all about contracts, I wonder if we're on a little bit of a collision course, okay? Because no, you got to be something distinct and different. That's a little bit different from saying, well, we'll take this contractual relationship we already have, we'll buff it up, we'll spiff it up, we'll add on some of those things they say they have to have, and voila. I call it ACO in a box. You know, or Chia Pet ACO is what I used to. You could tell I've been studying ACOs way too long, okay? But so maybe Chia Pet ACO is not so going to be so easy if that's a signal. And I'm not sure if it is or it isn't, but I point it out to you. The second thing is when I think about ACOs and I look around the Midwest, okay, which is easy to do, it's really flat and you can see really far. I think about, well, we talk about how ACOs kind of spring into being as if they came full grown, what, from Zeus's brow, right? But we actually can see, I wish somebody would study this, maybe it ought to be me, all the different ways that origination begins. And one in particular has caught my mind. I have no inside information. I believe everything I read in Modern Healthcare, don't you? So here goes. Okay, this is from this fall. Mercy Health System, a 3-hospital not-for-profit based in Janesville, Wisconsin, and Rockford, Illinois Health System, a 2-hospital not-for-profit, will merge to create a new health system serving northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin. The article goes on. I don't know whether the reporter was very tired or perhaps writing this in chunks. The deal had already closed. Okay, but here's what's interesting. Are you ready? And here's a quote. This is from the CEO, okay, of Rockford. We actually don't compete for the same patients right now, but we're close enough that we can create one large regional accountable care organization so that from some specialties, we'll keep it all in-house, unquote. Now, I have a little file, maybe you do too on your iPad, things I think about when I want to go to my happy place. Okay, so when I'm in line at the ticket counter, at the airport, and something I want to think about more, this has been sitting there for a while. Because I don't know whether to say hooray for ACOs or uh-oh. Okay, for the people of northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin, a market about which I know nothing, okay? But, and can you see why, right? I've been thinking a lot, and you brought it up, you stole my thunder, but I'm so happy to hear you say, about maybe there's a problem with how we define markets, okay? When we have here, I went and didn't look at a map, I have to do that all the time in the Midwest, okay? Contiguous markets, right, that appear to want to collaborate in a way that they're calling an ACO. Incidentally, no dollar, no money changed hands here. So this is merger to ACO, as I can read it, okay? So how do we analyze this? Do we analyze this, I'm so glad I'm not an enforcer anymore, under a merger, a conventional merger analysis? Or do we say, well, this is how they're building their ACO? And so you can see, you could spend a lot of time, maybe it's going to be a good exam question someday, that's what academics say, okay, trying to sort out, should we feel really enthusiastic about this? And it distilled down very nicely in the previous speaker's question of, so can non-competing entities combine to raise price? Okay, and I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's the question. Okay, and then finally, because nobody else has, I want to talk a little bit about sort of like a little addendum to the various papers, and they were wonderful, that were circulated in advance. A couple of little asterisks, ACOs in the Medicaid or safety net space have been slow to develop in California. Then a little asterisk, or it's not a robust. So I want to talk a little bit about why, and I want to do this from the perspective of, okay, so healthcare antitrust, most of the discussion, and indeed most of my discussion so far, has been about, so is it creating a thicket? Is it making it too hard, okay, for there to be a space for ACOs to develop either in the Medicare space or in the commercial space? But there's another way to think about healthcare antitrust. Could it be the handmaiden? Okay, could it be the handmaiden of the development of ACOs in the safety net or Medicaid space? And so I hope you'll bear with me, but I did spend a couple years of my life on grant-funded research and with remarkable Steve Shortell and another group of people. And at the end of the day, we reached a few conclusions, which I actually think still have some valence, okay? What is it that these other alternative forms of ACOs might need? Well, kind of think like a startup. They need money. They need entrepreneurial expertise, which, if you realized how foreign competition, the notion of competition is, okay, to providers would have formerly been providers of last resort, you would realize this might be the top thing that they need. So I call this entrepreneurial expertise, entrepreneurial zeal, for lack of a better term. I'm making these terms up, right? They need significant buy-in, not just cash, but culture, to health IT. And then finally, two things that actually I think healthcare antitrust might be able to help with. The first is specifically for rural and even for urban, for people who need specialty services, okay? Anybody notice in the proposed rule the change? Telehealth, right? It's huge. That is huge, okay? But the interesting thing, if you looked at the proposed new rule, you could see, so reimbursement through Medicare for telehealth only available to the two-sided risk model. Okay, not the place where people who serve a low-income population are going to jump in, right? My guess. Okay, none of them call me lately, but so I kind of wonder, so if this is a good idea, why are we not applying it in the place where it could do the most good? Okay, and then the second, I think about, so healthcare antitrust could make a bigger impact, but thinking about the implications of North Carolina State Board of Dental Examiners and scope of practice, control, okay, that essentially limits how a Medicaid ACO or safety net ACO could deliver the services it needs to deliver at the right price point, right? So, the recent opinion, North Carolina State Board of Dental Examiners, what it means, the Supreme Court couldn't agree. If you read the oral argument, it's hilarious. They're like, what would the world look like after we rule this? We don't know, let's go, But what we do know is that probably a significant number of the regulatory boards in the United States are infirm when measured against the antitrust law, the licensed professional. In Missouri, in fact, I can speak from personal study, they all are. Okay? So theoretically, there is no one who can sit right now in Missouri on a case of, impaired physician. All right, so, it's a fascinating opportunity because if we release the stranglehold, okay, which the Supreme Court may have done, all right, on scope of practice, then how is it actually that FQHCs deliver? They deliver because they use what? They use a variety of licensed healthcare professionals to the limits of their licenses. That's how they do it. And that is how ACOs in the safety net or Medicaid will also have to do it. Okay, so I guess sort of saying, kind of ACO is a sword, but maybe, and healthcare regulations, or maybe sometimes it's a shield, maybe there's more potential here, right? And then finally, I wish Tim Graney were here, but I'll channel him for a moment, and he'll probably email me if I get it wrong. But he had a wonderful paper in a bound volume just released by Yale. They had a healthcare antitrust forum, I guess, in the fall or whatever. I'm sorry, Medicaid. But in there, he talked about ACOs. And I want to embellish what he said. He said everything is about benchmarks, right, in ACOs. And nobody here really has said it so far. I know you're all thinking it, but I think somebody should say it on the record. So the benchmark is fee-for-service medicine, right? Broken, which several people have stood up here and said it's broken. So our new, shiny new, toy is based on the broken system, right? So I at least want to be able to say, we ought to think about the fact that maybe we ought to have a whole conference just about benchmarks and what would be right, because I actually think that that might be the linchpin to their success. Thank you for standing up, and I guess I'll talk to you all at lunch.
I want to thank the organizers for having me here. I am really honored to be on this panel, and also as a sort of newcomer to this space, I have just learned so much in the last couple of hours that I'm thrilled about it. So for my part, I'm going to discuss some of the potential options for federal and state governments seeking to strike this delicate balance that we keep hearing about between the promise and perils of ACOs with respect to competition. And over the next about 15 minutes, I'm going to give you a little bit, incredibly brief background on federal enforcement, because we've heard about it a bunch, and then talk about when to use structural versus conduct remedies, and not only in federal, but also in state. And some of the options for that, like when we might look at some of these different options, and then some additional state options for regulating in this space, whether, I'll talk a little bit about the certificate of public advantage and the state immunity stuff, but also in terms of some legislative options that might be useful for states to think about as some different options. Okay. So as we've heard over the last 20 years, we've seen a substantial increase in formal mergers in the healthcare space, and this has led to quite a bit of consolidation. And this is the federal merger enforcement timeline that we've seen in a lot of different modes this morning. But this is the one from the source on healthcare price and competition, which is the website that we run out of UC Hastings. And what you can see here is just, the vast dearth of enforcement that we saw, and some losses. The greens are FTC wins, and then the oranges are sort of action. And so that's what the timeline has looked like. And all of this is really relevant to ACOs, because as they seek to address the fragmentation in the healthcare system that's going on, one of the big policy problems that we see, they're trying to do it without hindering competition. And since we're seeing ACOs being created by a number of different ways, through independent entities coming together for the first time, but other ACOs are resulting from this background of healthcare mergers across the board. So we've already seen a lot of integration, and a lot of these entities are going to be coming and applying to be ACOs, and how they are formed should determine how we think about regulating them. It's not just these independent competitors that are coming together for the first time. There's a lot of different things that we've seen happen that are going to shape the space that we're living in. And so what you can see here is that, as all of you know, ACOs can take on a variety of forms. They can come from integrated delivery systems, hospital-based organizations, provider-insurer groups, and this horizontal and vertical integration is something that really should be of interest to us. And I think we're going to hear a lot more about this from Lawrence Baker in the keynote, and so I won't go into great depth about it, but vertical integration between hospitals and physicians really can enable either group to use its market power to demand higher rates and hinder competition, and also hinder competition through limiting referrals that come by purposely directing referrals. And so when we think about regulation, we need to think about both how horizontal mergers have gone and also how vertical mergers have gone, because I think both areas should be of concern. In addition to the different kinds of integration, both horizontal and vertical, that we see, provider organizations might use a lot of different kinds of means to form ACOs, right? They can come through alliances, which we're starting to see a lot more of. We can see joint ventures happening, and then the more traditional mergers and acquisitions. So when we think about how to regulate in this space, right? It's always the great debate between the structural and the conduct remedies, right? And so the focus of any antitrust enforcement action is to restore the opportunity for the competitive market to function. And so when we think about structural remedies, those are obviously changes in structure. They often require the violator to divest the entity. And then in a conduct remedy, you want to change the conduct, right? And this is what I do with my 5-year-old all the time. I put him in the timeout chair and hope that it will stop his conduct and prevent its reoccurrence. But in reality, a lot of the antitrust remedies that we think about and we see are going to have components of both of these. There is a role for both of these to be played in different points in time, and that's really where the rest of my talk is going to go. So when we think about ACO pre-merger, pre-ACO formation, pre-collaboration, this is the place for structural remedies. And the FTC has come out pretty strongly in favor of this. It's simple, they're easier to administer, and they're likely to restore the prior status quo. And so when we think about, what I want to emphasize here is when we think about these kind of mergers and how these entities are coming together, whether it's a horizontal merger, whether it's a joint venture or collaboration, or when it's an ACO coming together for the purposes of the Medicare Shared Savings Program, the analysis of whether these collaborations are anti-competitive is generally, but really should be, very, very similar. We want that to look the same in terms of how we're analyzing competition. We want them to look at the proposed collaboration, whether there's any sort of post-consumer cost savings, quality improvements. Is this a bona fide integration overall? And if yes, you're going to get, sort of towards the rule of reason. And when you get into the rule of reason, the real work in analyzing the rule of reason for ACOs is really going to be done in looking at the pro-competitive and anti-competitive efficiencies and really trying to balance that. So let's talk a little bit about this. As Tom mentioned earlier, he said that these things have got to be very fact-specific, right? It's got to be a fact-specific analysis of the existing market to look at whether this particular agreement is going to benefit consumers or it's likely to diminish quality or reduce output. And so the major question that the agencies should be looking at and do look at is whether this proposed structure is necessary to obtain the pro-competitive effects. And as we saw in the horizontal merger cases that were talked about this morning in terms of St. Luke's, the answer was no, that there are lots of different ways short of a merger that you can create these pro-competitive effects. But just because you can go short of a merger doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to do anything differently than the merger would, right? These alliances can create the same kinds of problems. And so I want to highlight some of those issues. So in an alliance, you can have a potential problem where you can have antitrust concerns come up if there's integration that is involving a substantial portion of the providers in a particular service area. And when you see that happening, if you're wondering about whether individual members, they can actually, whether or not they can still compete independently, or whether or not there are alternatives available to customers in that area, this should be treated in the same way that a horizontal merger would be. And you really want to look at that in the same space. Also with management contracts, if you've got one hospital organization that doesn't own but is managing other hospital organizations in the same area, this again should be treated very similarly to a horizontal merger. You can have some pro-competitive effects from this, but it doesn't often happen in that way. And then again, this question about vertical mergers and how this vertical integration works, it can still be very anti-competitive, and it's the kind of thing where you want to see structural remedies on the table for all of these different types of concerns. In other industries, we've seen vertical mergers be much more likely to use conduct remedies, and here I think that this should be something that is thought about and questioned more formally as to whether or not structural remedies are appropriate for vertical mergers in this space because of the broader market impacts that we can see from vertical mergers and vertical integration overall. Okay, so regardless of the type of collaboration or merger, if you're seeing anti-competitive problems in advance, you really want to think about structural remedies. Obviously, the FTC, and I'm not going to belabor this point at all, but obviously the FTC has come out in terms very strongly against pre-merger conduct remedies, and there's several reasons why it does so. They find it to be an inferior substitute for competition. There's large monitoring problems that we see as to whether the federal agencies can actually do this. There's high administrative costs. Enforcement can become so burdensome as to be ineffective. They only last for limited duration, so it may be quite in the interest of the organization to endure the conduct remedy for a certain amount of time in order to gain the benefits in the market, in market leverage 5 years later or 10 years later, and I think that's what a lot of people were really afraid of in the partners case. And often there's real question about unintended consequences and whether or not we're never going to regulate it just right. And if you're trying to do this from the outset and you have really strong anti-competitive concerns, this may create some problems. So we've seen that the FTC generally rejects these kind of conduct remedies in pre-merger or pre-formation organizations, but state AG offices have been often much more open to the idea. And we've seen that the Massachusetts Attorney General in the partners case came out with the conduct remedy proposal. The Health Policy Commission was strongly against it and ended up succeeding in that endeavor. But it did offer to put caps on price increases, component contracting. There were a lot of different things that were features of that. So while it didn't work in Massachusetts, we have seen it work in Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania, Geisinger has managed to get 3 conduct remedy settlements since 2011. Some of these are hybrid structure, both structural and conduct remedies. They tend to have, again, price caps, contract terms, things like anti-steering, anti-tiering clauses, bans on most favored nation clauses. We've also seen them work in New York. Conduct remedies go through, and the New York AG approved conduct remedy for the merger of Fax and St. Luke's Healthcare with St. Elizabeth Medical Center. And that banned all or nothing contracting, which is something that may also be quite a concern. No exclusionary contracting, and bans on MFNs. And so we can see these kind of contract terms being incorporated into these state conduct remedies. I think in general, anytime you're seeing a pre-merger or pre-formation problems, I think conduct remedies are probably not the way to go. There's some room for states to try and engage in this, but I think states should push back, as the federal government should push back and say that this is not, you need to come back with a different offer. You need to come back with a structure that actually works, and then allow only those structures that work to go through and get approval in the form of an ACO. And then once you get through that, then we can talk about how to tinker with the model, how to do a conduct remedy that actually makes a little bit more sense. So structural remedies, post-merger, post-ACO formation, this is the world that we're largely going to be in. A lot of these entities are big healthcare organizations that have merged over time. They're coming to the plate. They've already merged. We've already got a lot of concentration in the market. And so what we need to think about is how to manage that in the ACO space, right? And so it's a lot harder to get some kind of structural remedy once you've already seen once these entities have already come together, plus you may lose some of the pro-competitive effects. So here's where conduct remedies can really come through. If you've got an existing entity acting as an ACO, and they've got proven pro-competitive effects, they've sort of survived this first entry into the market, then what you want to do, but they're engaging in some kind of anti-competitive behavior, this is where we can see conduct remedies come in. And so here are things that we've seen come up in the merger space related to healthcare collaborations in terms of conduct remedies that may work for ACOs, right? So direct price caps per capita. This is mostly recommended in terms of spaces where there's so much concentration in the market that the market is not going to regulate healthcare prices at all. And what we see there is you need the government to step in that space. Because there's just the concentration is so high. Limits on total healthcare expenses. We've seen that with ACOs in terms of Rhode Island is sort of negotiating some of that. And then contract limitations. This is something that we see a lot in terms of conduct remedies. And so again, it can be component contracting, which was done in Evanston. There's pretty open debate about how well that worked, or it didn't work that well overall. You can also ask that ACOs to limit what they're doing geographically. But here we also see these all or nothing contract provisions, anti-tiering, anti-steering provisions that can be included in some of these conduct remedies. And then most favored nations clauses, again, can be prohibited there. And you all might also want to get approval for future acquisitions. Okay. Now I want to come back to these structural remedies, because I do think there's a place for them if we start to see market actors that have acquired a large amount of market share, either throughout a state or throughout a very large region, and they're abusing it in ways that we know that are driving up costs, and there's substantial evidence for that. In these instances, you hear a lot that it's impossible to unwind these mergers. It's impossible. You can't actually undo them once they've been done, and especially if they've been done for a very long time. And we saw in Evanston that they tried to do a divestiture 7 years later, and that was hard to do. But if we're talking about entities that have been together for 2 decades, 10, 20, 30 years, it's going to be a lot harder to do. I want to push the notion that that should not be off the table. We did it with AT&T. You saw they split into the baby bells. There are ways to do this, and the government has that power. It may be hard, it may be difficult, but it may be exactly what we need to be thinking about in terms of some of these massive entities that are driving costs across the board. So I know I'm really short on time, but I want to say that let's talk briefly about some additional state options. This is something that's come up a number of times throughout the day, which is state data collection. I think this is a great role for the states to play. This is very similar to what Massachusetts is doing. I think you guys are doing an amazing job with this. It's going to be really important to build the empirical evidence base for this. We need to know how ACOs are affecting the market. Are they driving up costs? But not only what are they doing in the ACO space, but what are they doing across the board? How is the presence of ACOs affecting the private market? Entities completely outside, what are they doing in Medicaid and Medicare? And you're not going to do this unless you gather the data. And so states can not only mandate that the data be collected, you can do it through an all claims database or some other kind of entity if you don't want to do it that way, but you have to not only gather that data, but have some kind of entity that will analyze it, and then allow you to step in if you need to. There's also legislation that I think could be very useful in this space. So the first would be legislation that would require the disclosure of price and quality data across the board. Instead of having these contract provisions be banned through conduct remedies across in sort of one-off cases, if you don't like these contract solutions, just ban them across the board. Just pass legislation so you level the playing field. So nobody can have an MFN clause. So nobody can have all or nothing provisions in their contracts. Instead of doing it in just those specific entities, do it across the board. Also, we can see state certification programs as we've seen in Massachusetts and New York and in Texas. So the last thing I want to talk about just really briefly is to say that we've been hearing a lot today about the debate with respect to state action immunity and certificate of public advantage. These provide immunity from state and federal antitrust laws. There are about 13 states that offer this kind of immunity either through state action immunity or through certificate of public advantage. They have varied requirements and degrees of protection, and they're generally, and the FTC generally opposes these. But Bob Berenson has recently come out with a paper that says there may be some advantages to these COPA programs. And I think that this should be a discussion that we have over the course of today a little bit more about whether or not these programs actually are beneficial ways for the state to oversee. I think it's going to be really hard for the FTC to monitor all that's happening. But I also don't like the idea that states can grant antitrust immunity to organizations in this sort of exchange. I think that the FTC is correct that the grant of state action immunity in some ways will permit behaviors, and only short amounts of them, but permit behaviors that would currently not pass the rule of reason. But there is some room here, and I'd be happy to talk. I realize I'm out of time, so I'd be happy to talk more about what's happened in New York and the program that they have set up and sort of what the FTC has done there. So in terms of final takeaways, I think that we need to see very careful scrutiny through pre-merger and pre-ACO formation and do all that we can to avoid unnecessary market concentration from the get-go. We need better data and analysis, collection and analysis on price and quality and competition, both within the ACO market and the market as a whole. And if problems arise once you've got these entities that they already exist, the agencies need to work with those organizations to find solutions. And then if we see repeated violations, we should very strongly consider structural remedies for those entities that are shifting the market in very real ways. And I think there's lots of roles for the state to play here, but it may be through legislation that affects the market as a whole and not in one-offs. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
I'm just going to talk very briefly about some of the things that came up both in the first panel as well as this panel that I think are kind of important factors in California and what's going on in California. And one of the things I think that is probably not unique in California, probably exists in other states, but I think hampers us a bit, is that most of the legislation and regulation of providers in the state occurs at sort of the micro level. Physicians are licensed as individual entities. Hospitals are licensed as individual entities, and they're kind of like Lego pieces. Each one individual piece has some regulatory oversight. But what's been happening in California is the Lego pieces coming together and building various kinds of structures, and they all attach new, unique names to themselves. Sometimes they call themselves ACOs. Sometimes they call themselves partnerships. There's this thing that was announced about 6 months ago in LA, Vivity, which was a bunch of academic medical centers and a health plan coming together and calling itself. I'm not actually sure what it called itself. I'm looking at Jerry. Right, exactly. But they made a huge market splash. So, like when my son was young and played with Legos, and he would, put Legos together and create this Millennium Falcon. Vivity to me is like a Millennium Falcon. It says to the market, I'm this big, huge, powerful thing. And then when the regulators that come, they say, actually, we're just Lego pieces. We're just these little pieces, and we're only functioning in the role that has been defined to us. So I'm really concerned that in other states, I think we've got some good examples of defining what an ACO is. What is this? If you're not an individual practitioner and you're not a health plan, what are these things in between? And I think California could go pretty far with coming up with some definitions of what these in-between creatures are. I'm also seeing like this wave of announcements of new partnerships, the UCSF, John Muir, and Contra Costa County partnership thing. Okay, what's that? That's not a merger. It's got kind of ACO characteristics, but what it is clearly a plan to gain market share in Contra Costa for UCSF. So I mean, we kind of know what the elements are that we're concerned about, but we don't really have the appropriate names and labels attached to this. And then the other comment I wanted to make is we every 3 years or so study regional markets in California, which is something we stole from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, I don't know, 20 years ago, you guys started that. And then Jill started it here in California with the California Healthcare Foundation, and we're right now in our third round of this, where we actually have researchers on the ground talking to people in the various communities. We're doing 7 markets in California. See if I can name them. San Francisco, Sacramento, LA, Orange County, Riverside, San Bernardino, San Diego, and Sacramento. And actually producing reports. And we've done 2 rounds in the past. We have another round coming out now. And we're right in the middle of that data collection stuff. And it's just fascinating what we're seeing people report is happening in individual markets. And particularly interesting, we just got the preliminary result on Sacramento, which was one of the first markets. And it's really interesting to see now 3 years from when CalPERS launched their big splash ACO, what's really happened. Because after the first year, we heard a lot about how tremendously successful it was, how they were able to deliver the same services at no cost increase. And now 3 years later, it actually turns out they're big now financial increases happening in that market in Sacramento. Dignity has lost its shirt now, partly because of participation in the ACO and the loss of inpatient days, partly perhaps because of other bad decisions that they've made in the market. But it's really interesting to be able to kind of look out a few years and see what's really happening and what's happening on the ground, which somehow hasn't cooled the ardor for these new partnerships that are cropping up. But I want to get back back to Jamie's last point, which was the importance of having data. I think it is critically important for us to be able, in California, to actually look at what's happening. These market studies we're doing are all qualitative. That's lovely, but it doesn't substitute for actually having real data. And the data that we have now, we can go really deep on hospital services, but when those hospitals are combined with medical foundations, we've got nothing. We don't know how those aggregated entities are functioning at all. So whatever we come up with in California as a solution, I think it's going to have to require some good definitions of what these are and perhaps defining the hybrids instead of letting the market define their own hybrid names. And then also having data so that we can effectively measure them and see what the end result and what the impacts are. So that'll back to Emilio. Thanks.
It's very difficult when you got the task of summing up such an excellent set of panel presentations, an excellent commentary, and you're between people and their lunch, in addition to being the jumping off point for Q&A. But I would like to say a few words. You don't see here a fear on the part of anyone with these different perspectives in dealing with the issues of aggregation versus efficiency. You see state enforcers, federal enforcers, the private bar, and policy experts all wrestling with that to try to find the right set of trade-offs so that we can encourage the growth of integrated delivery systems that will really hit the triple aim, as Dean Shortell would say, or former Dean Shortell, without causing anti-competitive effects. But what we're seeing here is that it's not so simple. We, as enforcers, thought, and Tom's presentation reflected this, okay, let's focus on the low-hanging fruit. Let's talk about horizontal acquisitions. Let's develop how the market actually works, and let's go to the courts with it. And mostly our federal counterparts, but also us in the states, we were successful with that. But we're finding that's not enough. So we in the states have to wrestle with failing firms. And we can't just say, well, the law says X, so that ends it, if we run the risk that we say no to an acquisition and then the hospital implodes anyway. Or the deal's off and the hospital that's actually having some cash flow problems can't find an alternative buyer. Or we have the situation in states where the horizontal issues are more problematic or the vertical issues are acute. And on the vertical front, it's not just healthcare that has these issues. Take a look at telecommunications acquisitions. The vertical issues there are paramount, and you will see a whole series of consent decrees from the Department of Justice, no less, that involve conduct remedies. Because when you're talking about vertical issues, the conduct remedies become more important. It's not just a simple matter of blocking the merger outright, although that can happen as well, too, as we've seen by recent events. I think the discussion this morning, as well as the panel here, have hit on another point, that you can't just talk about ACOs like they're some easy-to-define animal. You have a spectrum of integration with acquisitions on one end and loose alliances on the other, and all sorts of stuff in between. And as we look at that spectrum, we have to think about a spectrum of structural and conduct remedies that depends on the degree of integration, but also depends upon the conduct that's being committed. So you can have, for example, a loose alliance where maybe you say, we're not so worried about the integration, but then you become more worried about the conduct that's involved. How much are these folks locked up and unable to act independently? Another issue that is sort of the elephant underneath the table, and this panel has referred to it, previous panel referred to it as well, are large systems. Okay, we've seen that with partners. We've seen this in other instances. What do you do with such a pre-existing systems that may be so large? And what do you do with this sort of creeping acquisition type of issue? Like each little acquisition doesn't really raise these kinds of huge horizontal concerns, but in the aggregate, you suddenly find you have a problem. And most importantly, what do you do when you're dealing with these large systems that may be trying to realize efficiencies, but are also committing conduct that, again, has anti-competitive effects in the market? And that's why we have to look at these remedies as sort of a spectrum. Now, again, I don't want to keep you from questions and answers. So the final point that you heard from this panel, as well as the last panel, is wrestling with where are the lines between regulatory type of remedies and what antitrust enforcers can do. And I think you've heard that there's a big role for antitrust enforcement, and there always will be a big role for antitrust enforcement. And I think what you may be hearing, at least this is my personal takeaway, is that there's also a role for regulation in dealing with things like market failure. So Josh referred to the demand side problem, and this has actually become baked into the antitrust analysis, that patients don't really have the ability to pick and choose and force competition in the market. Well, on one hand, if you have conduct that prevents insurance companies from trying to give incentives to patients, that is something that we as antitrust enforcers can deal with. But at the end of the day, there's a need for regulatory solutions, whether it's Massachusetts, as Jaime talked about, or whether it's California with our transparency laws, which I wanted to put in a quick plug for because I think they're going to have a very big effect here. And so that brings us to the final point. I would agree with various panelists that getting more data is important. We need to figure out what works and what doesn't. But I would be remiss if I didn't point out on behalf of the antitrust enforcement community, although technically I'm supposed to speak for myself, that we always worry about collusion with respect to data. So we have to be careful when we collect the data if we're going to make it publicly accessible. We have to be careful of a couple of things. One is we want to make sure that it can't be used as a vehicle for collusion. So if it's going to be publicly available, let's aggregate it. And two, let's actually make sure that we're collecting data that will do the job. California, for example, when you look at OSHPD data, it doesn't collect data for all of the medical services, outpatient, for example. And so that can lead to distortive effects in terms of trying to figure out where do we separate sheep from goats and trying to figure out what kinds of integrated delivery vehicles work and which kinds may be more of a problem. So with that, I want to keep my promise and turn it over to questions. So please go ahead.
Sure. So Tom Brown, an antitrust partner at Paul Hastings, and also, and this is actually relevant to the question, the co-chair of our payments practice. So spend a fair amount of time doing antitrust work, but moving back and forth between two industries which don't seem to have much to do with one another. But there is sort of this parallel, and Josh sort of alluded to it. Like the theme that I took from Josh in his presentation was we spend all this time sort of worrying about the conduct, structure, and performance of these markets as they exist, and yet we're not spending any real time looking at the regulatory barriers that create that market structure in the first place. And if you think then sort of broadly about antitrust enforcement as it has existed in the banking space, for example, we had a similar period back in the 1960s where we had sort of ridiculously fragmented markets that were the product of a very specific prudential regulatory regime. And antitrust enforcement was directed at addressing bank mergers within that context. But then a group of fairly visionary antitrust enforcers launched a policy initiative within the antitrust division to tell prudential regulators to stop, to take down those barriers to entry. And what seems missing, maybe, like this is a question, like what seems missing is any advocacy from the FTC, state AGs, the antitrust bar as a whole with respect to those ridiculously restrictive barriers to entry. So like maybe I'm crazy in drawing that parallel, but would love to get the panel to comment.
Yeah, I actually think on the CON front, which is only one aspect of a regulatory barrier, the agencies have been pretty good and pretty consistent in critiquing those, although there is certainly more that can be done because there are a lot more subtle, indirect ways that entry is thwarted. And I do think, again, to go back to kind of one of my main points, that it is not true that the demand side cannot discipline healthcare markets. It's just wrong. And while a lot of the emphasis on this information gathering is put on being able to share it with regulators and members of the industry, and that's justified, what needs to be done is a better way to figure it out to get it to the market. I just do not believe that a Fortune 50 company armed with better information that won't promote collusion cannot discipline prices and provide employees with great incentives to produce high-quality, lower-cost services. And that if we spend all our time thinking about what's the exact definition of an ACO and how many bells you have to ring to become one, you were just doomed to failure. That the demand side has to be an equal part of the analysis.
Do other panelists want to first answer the question before we get to the next individual?
Yeah, actually, I think that's a really good point. And the idea of disruptive innovation, I think Josh mentioned, I think is something we really need to look at and perhaps try and step away from this idea that every time you build new capacity in the healthcare system, it's going to get consumed, by using data so people can make better choices. So one of the arguments that this integration leads to higher quality, I think, is absolutely true. Integration does lead to higher quality, but there is kind of a at what cost question. So if we look at the San Francisco market, the cost of healthcare in San Francisco is 40% higher, and the quality is about 10% higher. So is that a good trade-off? I don't know. We should let the market know that and let them decide and let people decide what they want to buy. Is it worth it to them to buy 10% better quality at 40% higher price? But right now, there aren't a lot of options because that's what the whole market costs. And so the idea of looking at medical care through new methods of delivering it and new models, I think would be really helpful and at new price points. But the idea of communicating what the value is, what's the quality at what cost, is an element nobody's got right now, and we need to have it.
I want to see if I have it straight. This is fascinating to a non-lawyer. So two hypotheticals. So somebody could go to the FTC and say, we want you to force the markets to, the providers to produce clear prices that are understood by consumers, because that's how it's going to lead to more competitiveness. Is that right? And
No.
That's not right. You can't do that.
No.
You should go ahead.
No.
So what can you do on the demand side?
I mean, go ahead.
Well, Kim Van Winkle from the Texas AG's office. Do you want to say something? You had another question. Yeah, no, I mean, we look at mergers and acquisitions to see if they're likely substantially lessen competition. We look at conduct that's likely to lead, collusion, lead to higher prices, lower quality. But antitrust is a blunt instrument. It is not, I mean, I always say, I'm not a regulator, okay? I'm an enforcer of the antitrust laws, so very different.
When you talk
now,
about demand, you're saying you got to do that through public policy.
No, I mean, the commission, Tom's exactly right. That's not an enforcement endeavor. But all members, all sort of stakeholders, to use the buzzword of the last decade, which I actually think is an unfortunate buzzword, can contribute to study and analysis which shows this sort of information is useful to people making better informed decisions in the market without creating a risk of collusion. I don't see, just off the top of my head, why clear quality metrics and sort of, long-term annual copay metrics of what this would cost could somehow cause a problem. And I think consumers are already, I mean, you see this happening. It's not as if this is just a pie-in-the-sky theory. People are voting with their feet in purchasing lower-priced, narrow-panel network products because they have better information that those are just as good as the hospital that may have the more prestigious brand.
And the flip side, again, antitrust is a somewhat blunt instrument, but to the extent that competitors are colluding to prevent more information getting to consumers, that is something the agencies have sought to stop, mostly for the importance of advertising, marketing are ways that companies compete and provide consumers with valuable information, and restricting that is not good for competition. So, yeah.
Just one more hypothetical. So just one more hypothetical. How about if somebody says, okay, we're going to allow all this stuff to happen, but we're going to use regulation to make sure prices don't go up, and so that's a regulatory approach. But how about if someone else comes along and says, I know the politics of this state are such that the providers will dominate the regulatory process and get whatever they want? Could somebody make that argument and say regulation is not a viable alternative because the political power is not right? Or is...
We can always argue regulatory capture, but who are you arguing it to?
Right.
No,
And the FTC, and the FTC is focused on, in terms of state action immunity, is, has the sovereign state, expressed a clear and clearly articulated an intention to displace competition, at which point we're out. We're not there. Antitrust doesn't apply and we're gone. So.
Yeah, I don't think there's a monolithic view by any means amongst providers and other members of the industry that sort of transparency is bad. There's probably some that would prefer not to have it, but I think there are many components of the physician and provider community that would welcome greater transparency because it will help them generate more business.
And that, I'll contrast with the years, indeed decades of litigation that were to suppress the Medicare, database. So there's providers and there's providers, and there's some who did not want known how big, their slice of the pie was and went to the mat for it.
Which worked in other industries that prices seem to facilitate the market.
Anyway, Kim had a question.
We're going to take one question from Kim and one from Jill and break for lunch.
This is related to the same topic. Does anyone think that payers consolidating with providers or leading ACOs is the solution to the demand side problem?
Sorry, I was just sending an email to the FTC telling them I was late for a call. Payers consolidating with providers, I think by and large, is not likely to be a systemic problem, and that all else being equal, I think payer-provider collaboration is good and promotes entry and competition at the provider level. What you want, for example, and this is why I think these bright line prohibitions are bad by and large, are, say, a payer that goes to the number 3 hospital network in the community and goes, look, give me a good deal, and I guarantee you I'm going to get you a lot of patient flow, and we will promote competition in the industry. And I think the prospects of that scenario happening are generally much greater than anti-competitive foreclosure. Where you run the risk, where things can be a little bit south, is when you've got a market structure, where you've got a payer with an 80% market share and a provider with an 80% market share. And there you can have what the Justice Department called in the Pittsburgh matter sort of a mutually assured destruction dynamic, where they can threaten each other's strong market position. And I do think the antitrust agencies are on the lookout for that.
So I just want to, I thought this was also fascinating. Like Jim, I'm just hanging on to try to understand what everyone is saying. But what I didn't hear was anything that's really distinctive to ACOs per se. And that's, I just kind of want to test that this is part of a much bigger conversation about aggregation and efficiency, which was how that was framed up. And ACOs is just sort of the newest thing. So you could have said the same thing about HMOs or about whatever the new flavor of the month will be next year. Is that right? Or is there something really distinctive here that applies to ACOs in a distinct way?
A former colleague of mine liked to say, same movie, different title. I think there is some aspect to that here, although there's no question also that I think the level of industry momentum, and this is a good thing, towards committing to this structure is probably far greater at this time than it's ever been.
I'll make one observation that we don't always have the right language in antitrust to add in. We actually lack, it's very primitive. We lack vocabulary, okay? And we often lack vocabulary to talk about quality. And I think the interesting thing is that when we start to try and distill the ACO definition, quality falls out first, right? And if we noticed that in the papers on the commercial side, it's out, 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 right? So maybe what would have been different, or could still be different, is that it isn't just aggregation versus efficiency, right? It's really more of a triangle. But we are impoverished in our antitrust vocabulary. Maybe it's time to develop it, but we don't really have a way, and I mean legally as well, okay, to talk about quality, and that is a great tragedy.
Just to briefly add on that, I think one of the things, I don't think there's much that's different about ACOs. I think that ACOs, because they are so driven in terms of they have these sort of pro-competitive goals, like as Anne-Marie was saying, like they're really focused on improving quality and driving efficiency. It's very easy in antitrust to think about a price, you know, comparing, oh, we've saved this much money through these efficiencies and we've had this, you know, versus an anti-competitive price increase. Like you can compare price savings and price increase pretty clearly, but it's really hard to compare what those quality goals are as sort of, as Maribeth was saying before, like how much quality are you willing to do in that trade-off? So the antitrust analysis of balancing those pro-competitive and anti-competitive effects is much harder when you've got real goals of trying to improve quality, and how do you balance those things? And so I think that's the potential challenge that we see with ACOs. But again, I don't think that's that different than what we've seen before, but I think there's maybe a broader commitment to those quality goals, whereas with HMOs it was much more about cost.
I would disagree about the notion that antitrust does not worry about quality. We always worry about.
Worry about it, but that it's harder to quantify. It's harder to make that. It's harder to understand that.
We have, but in assessing claims of quality improvements, there is often in the company's internal documents, in the provider's internal information about attempts in the past to improve quality and what it took to do that. And so no, I would fundamentally disagree. I know that in all of our wait a minute, Tom. Thank you. I think we carefully assess the extent to which a combination could lead to a significant quality improvement, and if the evidence is there, the agencies are not going to challenge that merger. So I would disagree with this notion that antitrust cannot encompass.
I don't think I meant to assert that at all. That
well,
you
I think
can't.
Anne-Marie said that.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes,
I'm not at all trying to assert that. What I'm trying to say is that the trade-off is harder to determine. If you're going to have an increase in price, how much of a quality efficiency are you willing to trade for that? And when is the increase in price or the hindrance to competition too much? So that's all.
Yeah, and I meant that the reason why we're not able to, I have no doubt, but to have a coherent conversation in the case law about quality is that we are conflicted. We have no consistent definition of quality in our healthcare system. So we are just plain old incapacitated to have that. That's why you'd say, well, in our procedures and what we decide to go forward on. But I'm looking for case law to offer prospective guidance. It's not there. And the reason why is we don't have a coherent vocabulary about quality in the American healthcare system. That's bigger than antitrust.
And this is a general problem with law, right? I mean, we don't have objectively observable metrics by which we can create sensible feedback mechanisms. I know that the FTC is defensive in the extreme about the extent to which it considers quality in its review of healthcare mergers and indeed all mergers. But the more general point is that we have no fixed star like the North Pole against which we measure antitrust enforcement in any market. It's not limited to healthcare. It's entirely anecdotal.
I will put in a plug for this whole ACO project, because one of the things that they've been doing a lot of work on is what kinds of quality metrics can we use. So for example, if there's an acquisition and somebody comes in and says, you need to let it go through because I can reduce morbidity by 2%. How do we know? What are they going to do to try to achieve that? How do we measure if they've achieved that? And then what happens if they don't? The FTC has been doing work on it, but everybody understands we need to have better metrics, and that's what Richard and his project, that's what they're all about here, is trying to develop those metrics so we can have a better conversation on that point.
All right. On that note, we are going to break for lunch. So thank you again to our panelists and our panel moderator.